about this in the past, this notion of fiscal restraint, this notion of resilience, the fundamental framework, the proposition that we've all advanced around prudence in terms of fiscal planning. I think that's foundational to the May revise. It's been foundational, frankly, to the work that's been done for some time now here at the state. And as a consequence of that restraint, as a consequence of our prudence, we are in a position with this May revise, building off of the January budget announcement, despite some additional shortfalls, to foundationally be in a position where we're preserving and enhancing and protecting programs that we all hold dear. Doesn't mean we're not making adjustments, doesn't mean there are not issues that we will have to navigate together with the legislature. But foundationally, the work we have done over the course of the last number of years to pay down debt, to use one-time surpluses disproportionately for one-time programs, the work we have done to reconcile the fact that we are a progressive state in every way, shape, or form, including a progressive tax system. And as a consequence of that progressivity, where roughly 1/2 of the residents in this state, or at least 1/2 of the revenue that we receive in the state through the personal income tax comes from 1% of the population, we recognize the nature of volatility. And we're going to be talking a lot about volatility, not only in the context of prudence in terms of fiscal planning, but in terms of the uncertainty that we're facing going forward. Of course, that uncertainty is not just as a relationship to the economy and the macroeconomic forces, but obviously to a number of other factors which we'll illuminate, highlight, and reinforce here in a moment. But I think foundationally, the foundation that we have established in terms of the fiscal discipline, in terms of setting aside resources, recognizing the volatility of our tax structure, recognizing and reconciling the nature of this slide as it relates to the inflows and outflows regarding capital gains. It's not only sobering, but there's a deeper foundational recognition in terms of fiscal policy as it relates to the state that is measured and considered, and again, thrusts a big part of the conversation, at least the presentation that we are advancing here today. This capital gains slide may be familiar to some of you. What may not be familiar is at 11.3%. That's the new updated 2021 capital gain. This is a percentage of personal income that is received to the state through capital gains, 11.3%. It's unprecedented in modern history here in the state of California. You'll go back to 2000. That 10.35% is reflected as a record in 2000. The 2021 numbers that were just updated for the purpose of this presentation in the May revise, 11.3%. You see that 5%, that's reflected in an estimate for some normalcy. We've had about average, if you look back over the course represented in this slide, the last few decades, the average capital gain percentage of personal income has been about 5.18%. We see that normalizing around 5% again in 2026 for the purposes of the Budget Act, or at least the budget presentation for the next fiscal year. We're projecting it to be a little higher, around 6.4%. Nonetheless, you get a sense, again, of the volatility, and you get a sense of those spikes invariably leading to those downturns. It's exactly why a few months ago in January, I laid out a budget with expectation that we'd be in this position. But last year, more importantly, literally at this time a year ago, we said that we likely would be in this position. And as a consequence, in that May revise, we proposed a budget where 99%, and I remember people rolling their eyes saying, you didn't mean 99, did you? 99% of the surplus dollars we proposed to set aside for one-time purpose legislature. We compromised in order to land the budget at 93%, which was among the most historically high, but nonetheless, it was reinforced, again, by a deeper understanding and recognition and a familiarity with this slide and the nature of our progressive tax structure. Let's talk about the January shortfall, $22.5 billion. It's been well discussed, well reported. We are now looking in May with a balanced budget of $306 billion, general fund $220 $4 billion, an additional $9.3 billion shortfall. That's made up primarily, not exclusively, of two factors. One, we have seen a shortfall in personal income tax revenue, roughly $3.2 billion, $4.3 billion shortfall from what we projected in January as it relates to corporate tax. We've seen an increase, interestingly, of $100 million in sales tax, about an 8.5 when you add all of the other revenue sources, about an 8.4, billion dollar revenue issue, and this is important, a utilization rate on the expense side of things, not just a revenue side, but on the expense side, higher utilization rate of programs and services in the state than were projected just a number of months ago. Let me highlight two examples. IHSS and Home Support Services, roughly just compared to last year, just on the general fund, it's about $2.3 billion more compared to the Budget Act last year that we'll be investing in IHSS if this proposal is advanced, 2.5 overall funds. That's just IHSS in terms of its utilization. Also, Medi-Cal and the full scope benefits that we're providing across the spectrum, we're seeing an uptick in terms of enrollment as well. Those are just two, non-exclusive lists, two examples. So when you add the expense ledger with the revenue ledger and the volatility, unsurprising, the PIT, the personal income tax, and the corporate side, additional shortfall of 9.3. What's that add up to? Just shy, it says 32. We round up 31.5 billion. So we have a $31.5 billion challenge, which is well within the margin of expectation and well within our capacity to address. That said, I want to reinforce the point I made in my opening comments around the issues of uncertainty. Perhaps the most consequential is this man-made problem that, of course, is being advanced by a Californian here, the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, that is, once again, seems to only happen when Republicans are in Congress and Democrats are in the White House, manufacturing a crisis around the federal debt ceiling. That impasse continues, and interestingly, and I call this out because I think it's interesting, in many respects it's manifesting earlier than we anticipated because of issues very familiar to all of us, and that's because of delayed tax receipts. There was an estimate that in October we may hit that debt ceiling. Now the expectation from Janet Yellen and others is that will happen sooner. The delayed tax receipts is an uncertainty not just in the macro as it relates to the federal debt ceiling issues, but here in the state of California. We had, as you may recall, serious challenges as it relates to major disaster declarations associated with the floods. Across the country, there were other climate-induced extreme weather events leading to similar major disaster declarations that also impacted their ability to collect tax receipts in a timely manner. As a consequence, the IRS established a relationship to the issues of tax collection, to the issues of these emergencies, and extended through October the tax deadline, which means for all of us, the cash receipts are in doubt. For us, it's roughly $42 billion, and I think this is the actual number. It might be worth writing down. $42 billion of delayed tax receipts. We project, this is imprecise science, it's estimates, $42 billion that will be collected later in the year. So we're going into a budget in a way we've never gone in the budget before. It's impacting, again, the country as it relates to the federal debt ceiling. Interestingly, climate change having an impact on debt ceiling conversations, which has global economic consequences, is just another reminder of how serious the issue of climate policy is. More on that later. But the delayed tax receipts as it relates to California, $42 billion we project in October. That is broken down primarily in two categories: personal income tax, which we project around $28.4 billion, or 32% of all of the personal income tax, or 23%, and about 32% of the corporate taxes will projected to be included as receipts in October, making up the balance of the $42 billion. So with that uncertainty, we stack on top two additional. One is around financial institutions and what's happened obviously here in California and across the country, notably in New York. Interest rates, you saw last week, I think it was a 10th interest rate increase since March of 2022. We're at 5.25% interest rates as it relates to credit policies, as it relates to startups, as it relates to the impacts of financial institutions, the direct cause and effect as it relates to SBP and, of course, First Republic. The broader implications are certainly highlighted appropriately here as uncertainties, and, of course, the big one, which is recession. And the question you're going to ask, and I'll just answer so we can get to other questions, is no, we are not modeling in the multi-year or even in the short run a recession, but we are pulling out a deep understanding of even a mild recession in terms of its economic impacts. A mild recession, it's a number familiar to you, about a $20 billion hit in that next fiscal year. A moderate recession, we're looking at an additional $40 billion impact in terms of projected shortfalls. And if you extend that out over a multi-year period, you're in the $100+ billion area. And that is an uncertainty that we must take very soberly and seriously as it relates to the macroeconomic headwinds. You stack everything above that, you stack prospects as it relates to monetary policy and Fed policy and the impacts we're already seeing to the UI and the impacts we're seeing on unemployment more broadly across this country. You saw those in the newest numbers that just came out. We are walking into a budget where we need to maintain our prudence, and we need to prepare not just for the short term, but the medium and long term. And so with that, reserves continue to matter. And that's why we are committed to increasing our reserves pursuant to the rules and regulations established under Prop 2, but also under the rules of engagement as it relates to addressing the issues of resilience and prudence and volatility. Just a reminder, in January, we set out record reserves in the January budget of 35.6. Importantly, you will see here an increase of $1.6 billion in reserves in the May revise. So we're going up, not down, in total number of reserves. That's primarily represented in the rainy day fund for public education, pursuant to Prop 98, Prop 2, and its relationship. We could talk more about that, but there are more resources in that bucket. We have hit the statutory 10% on the rainy day fund, so that's capped, and there's a spillover that we are putting into our retirement liabilities, meaning paying them down, PERS and unfunded healthcare liability. You'll see an increase from the January budget. Here's the January budget. The past 4 years, $10.1 billion we've invested in paying down these retirement liabilities. I don't know of another jurisdiction in the country that's invested this kind of money in terms of paying down its retirement liabilities. In the next 4 years, you'll see that number increase from $7.1 to $7.4 billion. In the budget year, you'll see that increase. I'll go back from $1.9 billion to $2.3. So an additional $400 million in paying down retirement liabilities. You stack those two, it's about $2 billion of additional investment into holding the line, paying down long-term liabilities, and addressing our needs, potential needs, if we enter into a recession, to be able to pull the trigger on the rainy day fund and bolstering the broader rainy day funds, including education. But here's foundationally what I want to reinforce, and we'll move through this. Will be a much quicker presentation than in the past. Preserving investments. This is foundational, and this goes to our values, and I've been very mindful of how concerned people have been about the impact on these fundamental core issues: education, homeless, housing, healthcare, mental health, climate policy, public safety broadly, and of course the issues of economic development, jobs, workforce development. And so you'll see as we lay out this presentation that we are committed to preserving those investments, particularly around transforming. That's one of the most, I think, interesting and exciting things happening in education in America today. Not the book banning and the free speech and the criminalization of free speech and criminalizing teachers and librarians in other states, but the work to transform the educational system and give real choice and voice to parents and make sure that we're providing support for professional development. That transformation continues. Prop 98 funding is $106.8 billion, modestly impacted versus the January budget. I'll get to that in a moment. And I say modestly in this respect. You may recall, and here's the number that matters I think matters disproportionately, and that's what's the per pupil investment. In January, we had $23,723. By the way, the year prior, just so you get your arms around it, last year, current fiscal year, last year's budget act that was approved, we're in the current fiscal year, $22,893. So in January, we projected it to go up. Now, obviously, the economic issues, we project that to go down, but modestly, $17. So de facto, pretty much the same, $23,706. If you considered the per pupil below, $17,444, if this is approved, the Prop 98 per pupil will be the highest in state history. That's the Prop 98, total per pupil among the highest in history. So despite the $2 billion is 108.8, 106.8, Prop 98, we're still maintaining unprecedented and historic per pupil investments. And I always think it's important, where were we a decade or so ago? You know, you're seeing 3x increase in terms of overall investments as it relates to our per pupil funding. 8.13 was what referred to as and this is where only insiders pay attention. If you are paying attention and you're wondering what I'm talking about, it's because you actually are paying attention. LCFF COLA. So the local funding formula, and what we refer to as the control funding formula, has a COLA, an annual adjustment. Last year, I think it was 6.56%, if my memory serves, but fact check that. January, we projected 8.13. It actually goes up in the May revised to 8.22%. So the COLA under LCFF in May proposed in the budget to the legislature, 8.22%. As it relates to transforming public education, I just want to highlight the commitments we maintain because they're unprecedented. If we isolated one of them, we would celebrate even progress just on advancing before and after school and extending the school day, 9 hours of curriculum. That $4 billion commitment, unprecedented, to fully fund before and after school and reimagining the school year and school day, that full commitment continues. The work we're doing on building community schools and creating capacity and extending the narrative beyond just the walls within the educational construct, but engaging the community more formally and substantively. That $4 billion, we continue. The special education money, the behavioral health, unprecedented support in U.S. history, certainly state history, to continue to provide a workforce and to provide those points of contact, wellness centers for physical, yes, but also adolescent mental health, foundational. On the learning recovery, we pulled back a bit because of pandemic focus on that. And as we architect all of these other supports, we feel that more support ultimately is provided, and that is indeed an adjustment, but one based upon the recommendations of our team. Educator workforce, continue to put unprecedented investments in professional development, retaining, not just recruiting teachers, and we're starting to see, even at the CSU, we're starting to see more people seek the opportunity to participate in an outstanding career as a public educator. We're starting to turn the tide a bit. That is a stubborn issue, not naive, but we're seeing a little bit of some optimism. Arts, we have the benefit of Prop 28 funding to offset some modest adjustments there. The universal school meals, my wife just walked in, always right to highlight, 2 full meals a day. Thank you, Senator Skinner, for her incredible leadership in this space. We're providing additional $300 million, new money, in the May revise to fully fund the utilization and the investments in that space. That's represented in the $1.6 billion, slightly higher than you've seen. No delays in transitional kindergarten, fully committed, but we haven't seen the utilization rates in TK. It's been highlighted by many, certainly highlighted by our own data, but that commitment we maintain. We'll continue to do more to get more of our 4-year-olds into TK. The equity multiplier, foundational to commitment, and we're following through on keeping it as well as keeping our commitment and promises to the UCs and CSUs. And this is meaningful. At a time when you're looking at a shortfall, we are making unprecedented 5% increases in the base investments in our institutions of higher learning. And I continue to say this because it's true. These are conveyor belts for talent. This is what separates our game from the game played everywhere else in the world, not just in the United States. The quality of education, the UC system and their CSU, and our community colleges. But that commitment, that MOU, that partnership for achievement, that framework we're fully committed to, including providing additional support to increase resident enrollment at the UCs. And you'll see that represented here, additional investment. We want more Californians accepted to the UC system. I can't tell you how many folks, and those are the parents of kids who didn't get into the UC applauding. And obviously you see here a debt service line. I'll get to that in a moment. We will be converting some of the cash to revenue bonds, and we're providing the offset to the CSU and UC, primarily for student housing and those historic student housing advancements as a way to avoid cutting real programs, providing the same support and services, but obviously we'll pick up from the state general fund those costs, so it's not a burden on either system. That student housing is represented, that $4 billion, in two appropriations, or at least two programs, I should say. Some member McCarty, others that were leaders in the $1.8 billion on the student revolving loans, the $2.2 billion or so that we compromised with the legislature. I wanted to get to $3 billion. We got to $2.2 billion last year. In the prior year, sort of stacking support for student housing because we want to address the issues of cost, full cost of attendance, not just tuition, full cost of attendance. And that's the issue of bringing down the cost of housing, addressing the issues, obviously, of financial aid, but that's subsidizing, and addressing broader issues around scholarships into the middle class, getting people engaged. That College Corps program, as you know, we have more volunteers than the entire Peace Corps in the state of California. I couldn't be more proud of those programs. We had a big event right here where we swore in 3,750 people, virtually and physically, in this room to take advantage of those college scholarships, 450 hours, all we ask. Opportunity, responsibility. We provide something, and you contribute to the life of your city, our state, and our nation. And so the College Corps is preserved. Of course, we want to deal with the racket that is textbooks, and you'll continue to hear me say the racket related to textbooks because it continues to be. And then we could talk about textbooks that are selling their souls and rewriting history another day in other states. That's a preview of the next few weeks and my focus on what's going on in states like Florida and Texas that are literally whitewashing history. College, of course, is one thing. If you have a child, it's hard to provide at least quality of imagination for a lot of children. That's why those college savings accounts are so foundational. And we're not backing away. We fully implemented that for 3.4 million people. Anyway, I'm proud of this slide. Debt-free college continues to be our top priority, and we're continuing to accelerate those efforts. Homelessness, we're not backing away at all. Fully funding, full commitment to move forward on that $15.3 billion, address the issue of cleaning up these damn encampments. $750 million just in that space. You'll see the home key money, room key money, infrastructure on bridge housing, and community care expansion, which is a fancy way of saying boarding care homes, and other flexible funding, including that $1 billion. This is all about accountability. And you'll see in the May revise of the trade bill, accountability, and that extends to housing affordability. It's about accountability. We extended a lawsuit, as you saw, not just to Huntington Beach, but to Elk Grove. I want to get ahead of myself, and if you ask, I won't answer today, so forgive me for previewing it, but it's important. There are others on that list, and we are prepared, working with the AG's office, who's been doing an amazing job in this space. It's all about accountability. These are the rules of the road. Legally binding 2.5 million units. Legally binding. And we are going to assert our rights, and we're going to assert the rule of law in the context of actually achieving these goals. And that's why these SEQA reform bills, in partnership with the legislature, have been foundational, 20 of them so far, and housing accountability unit that we stood up continues to do an outstanding job, and streamlining, which I'll get to, is something that is front and center in this presentation and our work over the next year or two, not just in housing, but across the board in terms of getting projects built. When we talk about preserving investments, we also talking about building a quality framework, not just to address the issue of your physical health, but the integration of your brain health. And we're going to continue to accelerate and improve our investments in this space. We stack all kinds of first-in-the-nation efforts, CalAIM, this multi-year commitment. We maintain it, the $8 billion in the behavioral health services and housing. We maintain those funds over the multi-year. You see the work we're doing to expand healthcare regardless of your immigration status. Stark contrast to the rhetoric of today, yesterday, tomorrow, as it relates to what's going on in this country. It's a point of pride and privilege that we continue to maintain that commitment in the May revise. Care Court, we have an additional 130. You see that $291 million. We have an additional $139.5 million, just shy of 140 in the May revise, because we're bringing in to the cohort of our early pilots in October, LA, and we're addressing the needs and requests from the courts themselves in terms of what they're looking for. You may see that number at the bottom was $100 million in January. The CalRx around insulin, $30 at cost, not subsidized. You're not paying for it on the back end, as is the case with a lot of the federal subsidies. Naloxone, we want to pull into that. There's a $30 million additional investment in bringing naloxone and doing our own manufacturing of Narcan, naloxone equivalents in the state. On the behavioral health front, I want to highlight, as we have highlighted in San Diego with the Pro Tem, I want to thank her for incredible leadership in this space, and Senator Eggman, so many others that have really been leaders in this space. The behavioral health bond, we're fully committed to advancing this. We want to do two things: modernize Prop 63, it's 20 years old, the Mental Health Services Act. As you may recall, housing was not a component of that act, nor was the issue of behavioral health, meaning issues related to substance abuse in relationship, to behavioral health, meaning substance abuse itself was not alone an eligible benefit of the Mental Health Services Act. So we want to address that. We want to focus on the housing components. We want to make it more consistent with CalAIM, part of a broader three-legged stool with our outreach efforts, and that's why that reform is critical. Of course, big part of the bond is about addressing capacity. Minimum of 6,000 units, home-based units, cottage-like units, and campus units. Clinically supported. We're not going back to the old days. Modern, state-of-the-art settings, and of course, doing what we must. And I want to thank so many remarkable leaders in this space, housing for homeless veterans in relationship to their serious behavioral health issues that obviously this country continues to struggle with and our state continues to struggle with. So that is a component, and no is the answer. We're not looking for this bond to then cut the programs that were on that homeless page as it relates to the commitments we're making for board and care, et cetera. It's not to substitute, it's additive as it relates to this budget. Climate commitment, we maintain that $48 billion that we set forth in January. You see the breakdown in the key areas. You also see in the bottom of this slide a commitment to do a climate bond, which I have maintained that commitment publicly on multiple occasions. We want to formalize that, working with members of the legislature. Eddie Garcia and others have been talking a lot about this, and we want to size it right. We don't have, nor on the mental health services bond, we don't have the exact number yet. We are working with the legislature in real time to land both of those, and that will allow us to do even more in this space than was proposed in January and is proposed in the May revise. Water as a component, I just wanted to highlight because it's foundational: safe, clean, and affordable drinking water, continuing to maintain our commitments in that space, consolidating wells, continuing to build on the work we've been doing over the last few years, but take it to the next level. Habitat, watersheds, drought support, we're not out of the woods on that. We continue to maintain investments in that space. The work we're doing in terms of ag and conversions and supporting conservation, that $8.5 billion commitment continues. Here's the new commitment: flood protection. And we have a posture of drought to flood, reinforcing this weather whiplash, reinforcing my connection to the debt ceiling, all issues related to tax collections, the reality of how climate impacts us in every way, shape, or form, reinforced by the fact that we are pivoting and transitioning, including $125 million of flood contingency funding that we're shifting from drought. It's reflected in this slide, but there's $290 million of new investments above the $202 million that we presented in January, specifically in this space. I'll remind you, since 2019, $1.3 billion has been invested more broadly in terms of flood protection. This is not a novel strategy in terms of recognizing the acuity of the challenges, but we do recognize the immediacy situationally of some of them, including Corcoran Levee, which we announced yesterday in the $17 million. I find it absolutely extraordinary, but not surprising, that you have representatives in the Central Valley that opposed federal funding for infrastructure and are not providing support for their constituents in their backyard as it relates to flood protection. I'm proud that the state of California is doing that job, and I'm proud that working with members of the legislature that we advance that proposal, and I hope the legislature adopts it so we can continue the work on that levee and address the issues around the Tulare Lake Basin. Issues relating to California, keeping them safe from floods, it extends to keeping them safe in every other way, and that's why I want to remind people of the investments that we committed to in January, the investments we are maintaining in May as it relates to our public safety efforts to support victim services. $50 million of new money in officer wellness and training. We've asked a lot from our officers. That's not just rhetoric we use during memorials or Memorial Week. We're putting real resources in that space, nonprofit security grants. We're maintaining the commitment that we had. I know that the legislature would like to see increase in that commitment. We look forward to working with them through the next month or so in terms of landing the budget. I'm mindful of those needs, and I'm certainly mindful of the issue of combating fentanyl. And I just remind all of you what we did over the course of the last 12 months as the DOJ is now hiring in the new fentanyl unit that's been created, the task forces that we've created, the work we've been doing all around the state of California, including amplifying some of that work in the city and county of San Francisco, the work the CHP is doing in this space, and the 144 National Guard men and women that we put out on the border as it relates to issues related to drug interdiction and fentanyl interdiction, and work we did recently to add an additional 16 members that will be doing a lot of the security screening around their large-scale X-ray machines. All of that as part of our public safety efforts. We take those actions seriously. We want to continue to amplify those efforts. When I say continue to amplify those efforts, it's reflected in this new slide, an additional $172 million above the investments that we promoted, which were significant in January. And this is for the naloxone distribution project, 130,000 people. We have to dedupe the 130,000, so I want to be cautious. 130,000 incidents where we have saved a life pursuant to the commitments the taxpayers and the legislature advanced through this naloxone distribution project. It works. It saves lives. We want to build on it, additional $172 million. We have grants for education, test strips. Obviously, we're doing what we pledged to do as relates to overdose medication in our K through 12 education system. And I noted what we want to do and we're proposing to do with CalRx, move beyond just insulin to naloxone production within the state to lower the costs and increase access and availability. So stepping up our commitment further, both on enforcement, substance abuse treatment, and obviously intervention and education. As it relates to more broadly issues that define our success or failure, the foundation to which everything else is laid, and that is risk takers, putting everything on the line for riches and new beginnings, small business men and women, people that make big bets in this state and provide opportunities for all of us. That's the jobs economic framework, obviously foundationally supported by those small business risk takers. And I just want to note that 327,000 businesses have been beneficiaries of those grants, not loans, small business grants, $4.2 billion that's been invested. We're committed, working with the legislature to land on the film tax credits. Thank you, Wendy Korea, all others, for their hard work in that space. We continue to recognize you can't have an economic development strategy without a workforce development strategy, and that's why we're committed to continue to do more in that space. By the way, we are adding back from January. I got a lot of feedback, and I appreciated it, as it relates to women apprenticeships in construction. We're adding that $40 million back. There was a healthcare component. There's a broad healthcare component, but there was one particular component where there was $40 million. We're adding that back, so that's $80 million that we have augmented from January back into the workforce development slide. On child care, I know there's a lot of attention on this. There should be. Trust me, I'm looking at my wife. There should be. As it relates to our expansion, we're still committed to the 200,000. We've done more than any other state in this country. We provided a new bargaining unit, and I'm proud of the fact that we led on that effort, and I'm proud of the Women's Caucus and others for codifying that and making sure that we met the expectation of that we all have as it relates to empowering our workforce and demanding better living conditions and wages. With that in mind, we're in process of bargaining. We did some short-term efforts as it relates to stipends, as it relates to fee waivers, and I'm proud of that, and I thank the legislature for that quick action. And we are committed, $6+ billion over the period in the budget, and of course, $3 billion of that's just general fund to that child care expansion. But I know there's a lot of desire and a lot of energy in that space, and we have a lot of work to do to implement and apply. But I put it under the economic and job development because it continues to need to be in this space. Child care is foundational to getting people back to work, particularly women, but particularly addressing the labor shortage that continues in the state, in this country. Child care needs to be front and center in that debate and conversation. Other issues we've highlighted: travel and tourism. You saw those new numbers coming back. We're getting back to record numbers. That's an exciting and long overdue I don't know, criteria, position, condition. Just glad to see people returning back to California. Still have a lot more work to do with foreign travelers, but that investment has really paid off, and I highlight it because I think it deserves to be highlighted, including our competitiveness under the Cal Grants program that's allowed us to recruit and retain businesses against other states that are more aggressive than ever in competing against the state of California. One of the efforts that we're focused on to be aggressive, more so than ever, is around reconciling disparities within the state. Remind everybody that we're the size of 21 state populations combined. It's the largest rural state in America. I love when some of my friends say, boy, you really need to spend time in rural America. I say, well, it's interesting. I've spent 55 years in this state. Know it as well as more than most. Largest number of hunters in America, and reside in California. Forestry jobs, California. Ag, no one comes close. So we recognize the importance of rural Californians, so much so we put $600 million to build off Fresno Drive and BK3 or B3K as relates to the work they're doing in Fresno and Kern, working on these partnerships, public-public, public-private partnerships, leveraging that $600 million for local bottom-up, region rising together resilience. We also had a fund on local sustainability as it relates to backfilling some property tax losses related to the transition to clean and green future. We have a particular focus in the May revise on the incredible work that's been done in Fresno and the incredible planning that has been done that allows us to make a commitment to Fresno in particular to accelerate that effort because they're teed up and ready to do something transformational. And so that's reflected in that reference to Fresno revitalization in relationship to the local sustainability fund that was previously approved, thank you, by the legislature. You see increase, there's a modest increase, understandably and appropriately so, for business grants for ag that have been impacted by conditions and floods. Oil and gas workers, I remind people the commitment the legislature we've made as relates to oil and gas workers, to skill build and to cap wells and to take those same skills and same opportunities as we move forward with transition. We talk in terms of a just transition. We mean business, and it's not just rhetoric, and we recognize we have more work to do in that space. So you came here not for all of that. You came here to answer the question, well, how are you going to balance the $9.3 billion? And here is what we laid out. It's not just the 9.3, it's the 31.5 as it relates to January and May. You will recall, this is a very familiar slide. No reason for me to go over it. If you have questions, finance is coming up. They can talk to you about what we talked about for a 2-hour period in January around laying out the January solutions on the 22.5. By the way, good government and efficiencies. Don't think for a second. I know people roll their eyes, say, well, what about making sure you're running a more efficient operation? We're maintaining those efficiencies, and we focused on codifying those efficiencies, and we believe that tax dollars should be well invested, well spent, and we believe we could do better and do more to be more efficient organization, and we take that seriously, and I highlight that as I highlighted it in January. But here is the question. You posed privately, and I will pose publicly and answer the $9.3 billion. So not dissimilar to the January framework as it relates to fund shifts, funding delays, reductions. You'll see one thing that's missing, and that's a good thing in the January versus the May, is there's no trigger cuts. So we substantially are closing this budget, or at least proposing, recognizing this is a proposal to the legislature, the following. I will break down now each item. The borrowing and revenue side of things. We have an MCO opportunity. MCO is well established. It's referred to as a tax. It's a partnership with the federal government and private sector. The MCO is a $19.4 billion. This is actually worth writing down. The commitment on the MCO from April 1st this year to December 31st, 2026. Within that bracketed frame, about $19.4 billion of revenue, additional revenue that we'll be able to draw down in partnership with the private sector and our federal partners. That's significant. That was not represented fully in the January budget, is represented significantly here in the May revise. So much so that it represents $2.5 billion more in terms of solving for the budget year ahead than was presented and proposed in January. The total number is $3.4 billion in the next fiscal year. $11.1 billion extended to increase over the next many years as we work through the details for primary care physicians and others, increase reimbursement rates, which is critical for our Medicaid, Medi-Cal recipients. So this is something I think will be well received. We will work with the legislature on the details of that package, particularly $11.1 billion. For the short term, we've laid out our proposal, working with many legislative leaders, but we have more work to do in this space, but it is a significant part of not just the solution short term, but a long-term revenue stream to address and to enhance and advance our efforts to secure and support our healthcare system, particularly hospitals and others. I'll be talking more about our hospital proposal that, well, not just ours, our partnership. We advanced with the legislature on early action in a bill that's on my desk. In that space, it's represented in terms of this discussion in this slide, also represented in terms of the budget that we're presenting here today. Other funds, as it relates to fund borrowing, team can lay out in more detail. They're familiar, meaning they've been used in the past. It won't have a direct impact on services. Relates to general fund shifts. Accordingly, we have some shifts, about $1.1 billion into the climate bond as it relates to climate resiliency that we're proposing. You have shifts of $635 million, correct me if I'm off, to greenhouse gases related to ZEVs, but that's to the GHG fund, our cap and trade fund. You have what I referenced earlier, which was the student housing primarily for CSU and you see with bonds that they will issue will backfill them in terms of the interest related to those bonds. That's represented in the general fund shifts. Unspent funds, and this is interesting, not ongoing one time, but these are funds that would naturally be swept up anyway that we are fast tracking and prioritizing. Let me give you just a couple examples as my mind, as they come to my mind. $200 million, for example, in the middle class tax cuts. By the way, $18.1 billion, eat your heart out. No other state in U.S. history has ever provided $18.1 billion over a 2-year period in tax credits, tax rebates. We just gave back $18.1 billion, about 9.3 this last year. We have about $200 million that we can sweep back from that, that we had budgeted that we can use for this. We have about $150 million, just shy. It's 149.4 or 6, I can't recall. $150 million for utility arrearages that would also be swept up. You'll get a sense of it. I think 280 in CalWorks as it relates to county relationships. So we're sweeping up a lot of unspent money. We say reductions, but they're not related to ongoing issues. Finance team could talk more about the remaining items. Those are just some examples, including funding delays, which, as you recall in the past, delays are not denials. Some may perceive delays as denials. I'm not naive, and that's part of the give and take. And you, I'm sure, members of the media will express yourself in that space in particular as it relates to the punditry around the budget and the engagement with the legislature. But these are issues that I look forward to working with and I think are appropriately discussed, but also under the circumstances, I think appropriate in terms of trying to find a balanced solution here and maintain our fiscal discipline. As it relates to issues that you may have seen highlighted in that slide, I mentioned the $1.6 billion more in reserves in total, but you may have seen on the bottom of that, it said safety net reserve from $900 million to $450. We are sweeping $450 million from the safety net reserve to help offset costs associated with Medi-Cal and CalWorks. We think it's exactly why that fund and reserve was created, and it will provide the opportunity to continue to provide the services that we've come to expect and the services that the legislature championed over the course of the last number of years. I know I've been speaking faster than normal, but I'm trying not to speak as long as normal. And so we are here now near the end to sort of sum up in an area that I've alluded to, but I want to highlight. I think a big part of what I want to communicate today is not just resilience, prudence, not just the work that we have done that allows us to be in a position where we can weather the volatility. And by the way, and this is a number also I think I'd write down. I have written it down. 177.7. 177.7. That's the last 2 fiscal years, the operating surplus in the state that does not include ARPA money from the feds. It's just extraordinary. You saw that 11.3% of the capital gains in 2021. That got trued up because those numbers in 2021, 101.4 billion of the 177.7, 76.3 in the prior year, 2021, of operating surplus. Just extraordinary. You knew it. You saw everybody selling capital gains. They saw what's happening in monetary policy. All of this, again, predictable. And that's why we maintain the discipline in terms of our fiscal posture. That's why I vetoed so many bills outside the budget last year. Billions of dollars. By some estimate, $22 billion of ongoing spending, or at least one-time spending, $10 billion in ongoing. Right now, we don't want to just build our reserves and our resiliency, but we also recognize the urgency of rebuilding this state. And I think one of the most significant things that hasn't gotten as much focus as it deserves is the unbelievable amount of money. I don't know if it's unprecedented. We're trying to do some adjusted historical numbers. But we have $180 billion that we've identified over the next decade in terms of investments in infrastructure in the state, 400,000 jobs that we can attach to that. The question for us is, are we going to get out of our own way? Are we going to leverage these commitments by getting more discretionary federal dollars, by being front and center with quote-unquote shovel-ready projects. And the only way to do that is to reform our permitting process, procurement process in the state of California. Not just for housing, not just for big stadiums, not just for homeless housing. We've got to do it more broadly in clean energy. We've got to do it if we're going to compete in manufacturing, the CHIPS Act, and things like that. So we are going to lay out next week, and I know you may press me on this, but I'm going to lay out next week, but I'm previewing it, a legislative package, to me, that is exciting, bold, and meaningful, that can cut timelines for projects by up to 3 years, save hundreds of millions of dollars. I think that's a conservative number. And reduce documents. And by the way, we'll give you proof points on these 3 points when we lay this thing out in a week or so, by hundreds of thousands of pages. It's just absurd. The world we invented is now competing against us. We're never going to advance our transition to clean energy in time to address our climate goals unless we are able to build these damn projects. And so permitting reform is foundational. It's long overdue. We've been doing it piecemeal. We've been doing some amazing work together with the legislature. I want to applaud them. And with our building constructions partners, meaning labor, as well as the environmental community. I know there's a lot of stress in this space, but there's a lot of opportunity in this space to land and advance through collective efforts and collective wisdom these reforms. And I cannot impress upon folks more how appreciative I am to hear the same from so many key members of the legislature that also believe we have more work to do in this space. So build is the goal. Accountability on housing, accountability on homelessness, driving forward on the commitments we made, not stacking more ongoing commitments that we can't promise we can deliver into the future. Being prudent and being prepared as it relates to all these uncertainties and all the risks, and being in a position where we're not misleading people, saying we can do something that we might not be able to do if conditions dramatically change. So that's the May revise. And I want to just thank Joe and my team and Ann, Dana, and Anthony, all the Tonya, hard work. Now I'm in trouble. I'm going to have to say thanks to every single damn one of you. But Joe is our finance chair, deserves all the credit in terms of the work he did. This was not an easy budget, but I hope you see we try to do our best to hold the line and take care of the most vulnerable, most needy, but still maintain prudence. I don't want to go back to the old ways. I've said this 100 times. I'll say it again. You don't have to be profligate to be progressive. And I think one of the worst things I've seen this over my lifetime, is we tend to write checks we can't keep, and then we let people down. And then we're cutting the program. And I don't think that's always right. And so I think it's better to be more honest with folks, what we think we can do and what we can't do. And that's why I look forward to working with the legislature to, make the appropriate adjustments. I'm blessed. Thank you to the pro tem. Incredible partner. Thank you to the speaker. He's been an incredible partner, his budget teams. The LAO's office, I want to thank them for all their hard work, and they'll navigate this. They'll look at the they'll be the usual back and forth. And I should note, though, that LAO, they came out remarkably over the 6-year proposal. We're off by $3.3 billion, which is just amazing. I mean, like, we landed almost exactly the same place. In between, there's some differences, which will be discussed and highlighted. Understandably. I want to thank budget chairs. I mentioned Nancy Skinner. It's been incredible to work with Nancy or Senator Skinner. And of course, Phil Ting, budget chair at the Assembly. They've done a remarkable job to help with their colleagues to support the resiliency that we're advancing here today, to put us in a position to make this proposal. And in closing, final words, and we'll answer questions. I'm also deeply mindful of the requests, having met with all the caucuses, having addressed the incoming that I'm getting, the needs that people are expressing and recognizing that we have to address. I'm mindful of the enormity of those requests, and certainly look forward, because we're not ideological about any of this, working through that process, working with stakeholders, working with the legislature to make the appropriate adjustments This is our proposal. Legislature is the appropriator. They are our co-equal partners. I cannot impress upon all of you more how proud I am of the work we've done together in the last 4 years. It's a little more challenging to navigate this year and potentially the next few years. But in the spirit that's defined the last 4 years, I look forward to engaging in the next 4 or so weeks and getting a budget that, under the circumstances, will make Californians proud. With that, I'm here to answer any questions. Nope. Not with all the uncertainty described, not with the debt ceiling uncertainty, not with the interest rates environment, not with the constraints as it relates to monetary policy in terms of how that's impacting lending, how that's impacting the volatility, particularly as it relates to capital gains, the stock market itself, which we are disproportionately rise and fall on as it relates to revenue frame and the prospect of even a mild recession.
You also mentioned the $20+ billion in legislative proposals or bills that you vetoed last late summer. And I'm wondering if you have a message to the legislature today. Are you prepared to say, please don't send me any fiscal bills after this budget is negotiated?
No, I don't think you'll talk to one of them, and I'm sure you'll rush over there and ask them. That in all the caucus meetings, I was very clear, and not an argumentative way, just being honest. We got to get this done during the budget. We have all these amazing bills; they're amazing. I mean, nothing worse. I sit here, I care about what they care about. The vast majority of the bills I get, I'm like, I'd love to do that, but I also have a responsibility. We have a collective responsibility, and at the end of the day, I guess I'm the backstop, and I say no, everyone gets upset. You do 5 pieces on the nightly news about Newsom cut or vetoed this, but this, it just, some people know that's going to happen. And I want a little expression of a deeper understanding now of the nature of the budgetary constraints, and just get it done in the budget. If this is your top priority, work with your colleagues to the extent we share that priority. I said I'm here to help. I'll work with you guys if this is more important than that, but then you got to deal with that. You got to cut that or move that. So it's just common sense here. There's not a frame. It's not a dialectic. I mean, it's not an argumentative frame. But we have to be more disciplined in that. And if we're not, we'll just be back to past practices. But again, that misleads people. It makes them think because something passed that it's going to happen when, in fact, it doesn't line up with the economic or at least budgetary realities.
Thank you.
Thanks.
This is Adam Beam from the Associated Press. Governor, the Legislative Analyst Office said that your January budget proposal was not balanced in the future years. I'm wondering, is this proposal balanced in the future years? And if not, why not?
2010, 14, 15, 16, write these down, 18, 5.3 billion, 20. Because of the volatility and the uncertainty, particularly as it relates to the October revenues, we're going to need more clarity in order to frame a deeper understanding of what needs to be done in the short term to address the issues in the out years. We're very mindful of that. And we've had extended conversations with the LAO. That will be highlighted again. It's balanced in the next budget, at least budget year, and in the out years, we still have work to do.
When it comes to the deficit, how important is this delayed tax filing? I know that the last time this happened in 2020, you also had a very large deficit you announced, and then that deficit didn't come to pass, as the revenues came in. Do you think something might happen like that this time?
Well, I hope so. Do I think so? No. Why? Let me give you a stat that's interesting, one that's seared in my mind. A few of them today. $2.9 billion of PIT withholding since the Budget Act through April decline, meaning we're down $2.9 billion in withholding. Withholding gives you a little bit of preview of things to come. I mentioned the $28.4 billion of the 42 that is PIT related, about 23% of overall collections. in October. Based upon the nature of the macroeconomic situation and the headwinds that we're seeing in Fed policy, I think that's unlikely, but I'm hopeful. But you can't budget on hope. So we're cautious in that respect. But again, that follow-up question is also an answer to your first question. As it relates to being able to see in the future, it's even more difficult to see into the future, even the immediate future, because of the nature of this extension and the magnitude of it as it relates to not only what's happening in California, but how consequential those extensions were to the debt ceiling debates and the posturing by Republican leaders in Congress.
Hi, Governor. Alexi Kosseff from Cal Matters. Last month, Senate Democrats put forward a corporate tax increase as a budget idea. You swiftly rejected that. And I was wondering if you are taking off the table any sort of tax increase as a potential solution to address the budget deficit, even if the situation continues to worsen into the next year.
Well, it's an interesting proposal. I mean, we're still handing out checks, tax rebate checks. We still have a couple $100 million more that we're distributing of the 18.1 over the last 2 years. We're in a fiscal year, current fiscal year, as we speak, where we enjoy the fruits of $101.4 billion operating surplus. I highlighted the corporate tax reductions from January to May, $4.2 billion, and the economic uncertainty. I do not think it's the right time to raise taxes, and I was crystal clear on that.
So is that beyond the corporate tax proposal? Are all tax proposals off the table for you?
Well, how do you raise taxes when you're enjoying $177 billion operating surplus over the last 24 months and you just sent $18.1 billion of tax rebates and look people in the eye? I don't think it's the right time. I don't think it's the right thing to do at this moment. And so you always, no one could be wedded ideologically to conditions that may present themselves. But right now, we're able to submit a budget that we think is prudent and balanced. We're maintaining our reserves, our posture. In a mild recession, we can work through and weather. Those are conversations for another day.
And then could you just address the lack of additional funding for struggling public transit agencies?
Well, those were additional dollars that were added last year that didn't exist the prior year. There are just not as many of them on the basis of the economic volatility and the revenue volatility. I think that answers itself.
Hi, Governor. Angela Hart, KFF Health News. A few years ago, you led the restoration in California of the state's individual health insurance mandate. What do you say to critics, Governor, who say that you've since backed out on your promise to use that money on affordability assistance? And, you know, despite federal assistance, consumers need help now affording coverage.
Well, what I'd say is I was very proud to be the governor that introduced to the legislature the idea of extending middle-class tax cuts by using state funds to do that. I was also very pleased to be the governor of the state of California, to be able to thank the White House for extending them themselves so that we didn't have to do that unilaterally, so we can maintain them. So we've maintained them. But we want to be mindful of the totality of needs within the behavioral health and substance abuse and mental health, not just the issues of physical health, mindful of the entire system and the needs to balance priorities. So we led on that. Those subsidies are in place. I know people want to stack additional subsidies on top to go deeper and broader as it relates to those efforts, but I'm very proud that we initiated those efforts, very proud that the legislature adopted them.
Governor, in January in your budget, you had in there a proposal to add a community support service in your CalAIM initiative to cover for people at risk of homelessness or people experiencing homelessness up to 6 months of free rent. Unless I'm missing something, I didn't see that in the May revise. Am I wrong? And if not, please explain why that's no longer funded in your budget.
That's why I have Dr. Galley here, who will talk to you in a moment.
Governor, can you explain if that service is
Oh,
no
no,
longer...
Dr. Galley can walk you through what's in the budget in detail. There's no point for me to do what he can do better in terms of the nuances of the Callahan proposal, which substantially is funded at the scale that we had
Okay,
previewed.
since you're punting on that,
No, it's not punting. I know a lot, but I don't know everything. That's all. So forgive me not being able to nuance that answer in terms of the complexities of the Callahan proposal, which, as you know, are multifaceted, from 1115 waivers, 1332 waivers, to the complexities of a multi-year extension, billions and billions of dollars, to a lot of criteria of considerations relates to federal moves that we still have to advance, and a lot of movement within the framework of priorities. This is, in the best of times, some of the most complicated work one can do. And that's why I couldn't be more proud to have someone as extraordinary as Dr. Galley doing it, and he's here, so we might as well take advantage of him being here.
Okay. Good morning, Governor Newsom. Antonio Harvey, California Black Media. The task force to study, develop reparations, and proposal for Americans will be issuing its final report at the end of June 29th to be exact. Among its recommendations are that state issue a formal apology for slavery and provide cash payment to Black Californians. Given the current budget deficit and potential challenges in convincing lawmakers to provide funding for reparations, have you thought about the state can practically do the right, have you thought about what the state can practically do to right the wrongs of the past?
Yeah, no, I'm looking, absolutely. We've thought a lot about this, working very closely with legislative leaders, members of the Black Caucus, obviously members of the task force themselves. They put out a preliminary report. We put out a statement in relationship to that. I would encourage you to review the statement in terms of this direct answer to your question. But look, my posture is let me receive now the final report, continue to work with legislative leaders and the task force and assess where to go from there. But we put out a statement that was amplified in no small part by Senator Bradford and Assembly Member Joan Sawyer and others, and we look forward to reviewing the details of the task force recommendations.
Thank you for your response. I have a follow-up question.
Please.
Also, in your education, in your education budget, you proposed $300 million in new annual ongoing funding for high-poverty schools. This was supposed to be your response to AB 2774, authored by Dr. Akilah Weber. However, Black educators who supported Weber's bill feel that Black students who are the lowest performing academic subgroup and the focus of Weber's bill are not getting the degree of support that they need to improve their academic performance. Additionally, California legislative analysts has opposed the plan, saying that the state should focus on accountability and transparency instead of providing additional funding. Given the budget deficit, what is the future of this proposal?
Well, I'm committed to it. I'm not going to back away from it. With respect to the Legislative Analyst's Office, I think we do need more money in this space. And by the way, 8.22% on the COLA for the local control funding formula is not insignificant. The funding we're making as relates to historic per pupil investments under Prop 98 is not insignificant in answering and advancing that question. But I made a commitment to the Black Caucus. I made a commitment to Weber herself. We're going to fulfill it. It's in the May budget, and we look forward to working side by side with them to advance the cause of addressing these systemic issues. And I take them very seriously, and I'm very mindful of the totality of the need, which far exceeds this current proposal. But we are absolutely focused not just on the short term with the fiscal constraints that we are presented, but the medium and long term to address these issues once and for all.
Good morning. Morgan Reiner with ABC 10 and CBS 8. Thank you for taking our questions. The state was facing a budget deficit before the winter storms, delaying tax filings, before the congressional debt ceiling debate, some of the other circumstances that you mentioned. So for the people sitting at home watching everyone's coverage today, can you explain, for those who are not finance majors, how the state went from, $100 billion surplus, handing out checks, to now this nearly $32 billion deficit?
It's called progressive tax structure. Not even complicated. We have one of the most volatile tax structures because of the over reliance or the disproportionate reliance on a very small subset of tax filers. As the markets do well, we tend to do better. As they do badly, we tend to do worse. It's very familiar. It's not complicated in the context of any historical frame. It just complicates, in the short run, our ability to plan for the future. And that's why it's incumbent that as we do plan, that we set aside not only ample reserves, but we do what we can to pay down debt, which we did when I got here, to be creative as it relates to maintaining discipline and structure, as to not get ahead of ourselves on ongoing investments. But this slide says it all. Volatility. We do extraordinarily well when interest rates are low, when markets go up, massive windfalls, $177.7 billion that we're enjoying in the current fiscal year. But when monetary policy changes, quantitative easing, this relates to interest rate environment and the 10 increases since March 2022, constraints as it relates to credit and lending, the impacts on the NASDAQ, particularly S&P, obviously the Dow. It's reflected in the volatility, this EKG, called capital gains chart, which every governor has presented. Quite literally. I still indelibly remember the front page of some newspaper and Jerry Brown with not a modernized version, but a board pointing to this chart. In fact, I'll do it like this and reminding everyone. But here's the good news. A progressive tax system allows us to stack away billions and billions of dollars for exactly this moment. And that's what we've done. And that's the real lesson of the last number of years, is we can use this to our advantage. It's not just a disadvantage if you're wise in terms of how you set aside and utilize resources. And working with this legislature in the last 4 years, we're in a position where I'm not announcing that we're cutting by half our expansion of healthcare. We're not cutting our commitments to the UC and CSU. We're not making any of that. We're not cutting homeless funding. We're not cutting investments substantially in housing. There's a marginal, within the margin of error, adjustments here and there. And that's because of the prudence and the discipline exercised by the legislative leaders in the last number of years. And Governor Brown deserves a lot of credit in his last few years in particular in terms of setting that tone and tenor. And I've maintained it. We've been, in fact, even more stubborn in some respects than even Brown was, for good reason, including, as was noted earlier, making sure that things done outside the budget, we don't get ahead of our skis.
Quick follow-up. Speaking of a progressive tax structure and progressive values in general, I saw that there is an increase in money to help expand healthcare access for all and for those who are undocumented as well. Can you explain the state of the social safety net programs in California when it comes to the increase we're expected to see in the state with the end of Title 42 and whether or not the budget can handle that increase?
Of course. I believe in universal health care. It's not pablum. It's not just an applause line. It's something I've long believed and championed. I was mayor of San Francisco, became the first city in U.S. history to provide universal health care regardless of pre-existing conditions, ability to pay, or immigration status. It's a point of pride. I committed to that as governor. We advanced that, working with the legislature, legislative leaders over the last few years, advanced it for 50 and over, and now committed over the next couple of years to architect the framework for everybody else. I believe when everybody's covered, by the way, they already are, on the back end, it's called the emergency room, you're paying more in premiums insurance, so the expense question should be in relationship to the status quo in this country, and the common sense should be extended to the question of California trying to address those cost drivers on the back end. Better to invest in a vaccination than into taking care of someone's chronic disease. That's our approach to healthcare. We believe more people covered, it stabilizes that coverage and cost for everybody. We don't believe in sick care. We're advancing a new paradigm in the states, represented in all those reforms we mentioned from Cal-AIM on down. And I just, I believe it's the right thing to do. And I don't think any of the current mishigosh and conversations, a lot of mishigosh, that are happening as relates to the current Title 42 conversation in relationship to your question will be of any consequential impact in terms of our ability to fulfill that commitment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Governor Nicole Nixon with Cap Radio News. Your budget includes cost of living adjustments for education and child care workers. I don't see one for other state employees, and they're asking for one. Just want to be clear that this budget does not include that COLA for most other state workers.
No, we have set-asides in the budget. Joe and the team can talk a little bit more about that. For our bargaining units, we tend not to land the bargaining in public. We're in the process of negotiating with many bargaining units, and we value our workforce. We value the sacrifice, particularly over the last number of years, that so many have had to make with their families and balancing work with all of the conditions and the challenges, particularly related to the pandemic. And we are mindful of the inflationary environment, also hopeful that they're mindful of our current budgetary environment. But we look forward to announcing those collective bargaining agreements in very short order.
And then I did want to ask, it's been over a week since the legislature passed AB 112, which the distressed hospital loan bill. I'm wondering when you have plans to sign that.
Shortly. Shortly. Well, I don't know. What was the day? I don't know what I'm doing after this. We worked hard on that bill. Grateful for the legislative leadership. Very, very aware of what's happened to hospitals the last few years, speaking of the pandemic, particularly rural hospitals across this country, not just here in California. I want to thank so many members of the legislature for their partnership in terms of moving this bill forward, and look forward to announcing when and where and how. How is easy, it's pen and paper. We'll sign that bill.
Lindsay Holden from the Sacramento Bee. In January, you mentioned that lawmakers were lighting you up to carry homelessness accountability legislation. Can you share why you haven't endorsed any policy proposals from legislators so far? 2,600
reasons. Maybe 2,601 reasons. That's how many bills were introduced. I've not been able to navigate all of the bill package. I have weekly meetings, quite literally weekly meetings. Christy, you're somewhere here, my ledge director, and we go through, and it's a few hours just to go through 20 bills. You start doing the math. So we're in the process of doing that, seeing what gets whittled down, what's an appropriation, what's not. So we land where we need to go. You'll see a lot of language in the May revise around accountability. You'll see a lot of language in the 8 pages that you may have received. In the summary, you may have been more interested in reviewing than my comments today around accountability. And we look forward to working with the legislature to advance them.
Also, your revisions talk about with the HAP funding statutory language around accountability. Will that include requirements for housing element compliance?
Well, it's a good question, and it's an interesting one. We are pursuing compliance, as you know, more than any previous administration, in partnership with our outstanding Attorney General, who gets it and is getting it done in partnership with us in the space, Huntington Beach, Elk Grove, and a number of others that we are queuing up that simply have turned their back to the housing element. Arena goals, more broadly, other statutory housing-related goals. I don't know that we need to couple them, but certainly for me, both and housing and homeless accountability is foundational in the work we're doing. As it relates to specific bill packages, we'll leave that to open-ended discussions.
Just to be clear, so you do plan to work with the legislature on a policy bill related to homelessness accountability?
Oh, I certainly look forward to strengthening accountability. I've not been shy about it. We did so. I want to remind you, we have homeless accountability plans. They were submitted pursuant to requests we made and requests that many legislative leaders made as well. We worked together. The first plan came out, and I rejected it. I met just across the hall here with dozens and dozens of leaders up and down the state, city representatives, county representatives, and what we refer to as COC representatives, and they expressed themselves very boldly and clearly back to me, saying they were not happy with having those plans rejected. They came back with more ambitious plans. I was here at Cal Expo a few months ago, you may recall, to kick off my State of the State tour, 17 events, 5 days. That was the first event, tiny homes, and we announced that we approved the new accountability plan that we had worked with the legislature to advance. What you may be referring to is strengthening those provisions, and I'm all for strengthening provisions and building off the good work we've done in that space. There has never been accountability in this space in the past, and we have advanced aggressively accountability, and I certainly am committed to seeing more. And I'm pleased, in closing, because I think this is important, that the mayors themselves agree. It's just been incredible how supportive they've been in recognizing our collective responsibility to all be more accountable and to do better in this space. It is a crisis. It is unacceptable what's happening in the streets and sidewalks, and we must address these issues much more aggressively, particularly as it relates to encampments in this state.
Governor, this is Christine Duke from the Wall Street Journal. Just following up on reparations, I know you've made some comments about reparations in California going beyond cash payments. Can you say whether you believe cash payments should play a role in reparations plans going forward in California? And if so, what are your thoughts on the idea from Senator Bradford that the state should kind of put some good faith money in an account or toward an agency that would represent something like 0.5% of the state budget? That would be something like $1 billion out of the general fund, or $1 billion if you take just that percentage out of the general fund. Can you tell us what you think that role should be?
I look forward to reading the report when it's submitted, the final report, and I would encourage you to review the statement I put out yesterday.
So no thoughts yet on the idea of cash?
I have a lot of thoughts. I just refer to the statement I put out yesterday and my desire to read the report, final report, when it's submitted, and we'll have plenty of time to then begin the process of discussing in detail recommendations, the merits, demerits, working with the legislative leaders, working with members of the reparations task force.
And on local homelessness funding, I know that the big city mayors, League of California Cities, CSAC, all put out a letter asking you for ongoing funding in the budget going forward. I know this is something they've asked for before and something that you've responded to before. Yeah. You know, given that this has been an ongoing request, given that you have considered this an emergency in California, that you have considered this one of the top priorities for Californians and for our state government, is there any budget picture in the future that you see the ability to do ongoing funding for this top priority of yours?
Look, bottom line, there's never been a governor in history of the state that's been more focused on an issue and more committed to advancing solutions to solve this problem. And we have a legislature that can lay claim to the exact same status. When we got here, there was $500 million appropriation. It was done at the encouragement of the big 13 mayors at the end. I think it was big 11 back then, whatever it was. And there was no plan, no strategy, no accountability. $15.3 billion, you saw that slide. The commitment and resolve is next level. We're about to work with the legislature on a bond as it relates to the issue of mental health more broadly defined, working on conservatorship bills, have Care Court coming online in October, $750 million. It was $50 million 2 years ago on encampment resolution grants, unprecedented investments in purchasing housing in real time under Home Key, which has become a national model. The scale and scope of the problem is profound and acute. Issues related to substance abuse and people self-medicating, and the issues related to mental health exacerbating this. As long as I'm here, I'm committed to advancing that cause. What I'm also committed to is advancing the cause of prudence as it relates to balancing the totality of the budget and priorities that are represented in the desires, goals, and aspirations of 40 million Californians. I'll just leave it at that. No one's done more in homelessness. No one's committed to doing more. And I'll continue to do what it takes to amplify programs that are working and to move away from programs that are not, and to hold all of us to a higher level of accountability. State vision's realized locally. Local government's foundational in this, and we want to see real progress. We'll promote that progress through funding as long as we see it. If we don't see it, we will pivot.
Hi, Governor Laura Mahoney with Bloomberg. You made your position pretty clear on the Senate Democrats' proposal on the corporate income tax, but there are some other tax items in that. Net operating loss suspension, cap on corporate income tax credits per year, which are mechanisms you invoked at the beginning of the pandemic. Also, there's a funding for the credit for union dues, which is a bill that you signed last year that requires funding. Can you talk at all about where you are on those items?
Yeah, look, we're not, as long as I'm here, that's NOL, we just reestablished it. Helped us get R&D facility back, Tesla in California. We dominate in R&D. I want to maintain that dominance. I don't support the proposal as was put out. We made that crystal clear. That includes a number of those proposals. And to the extent that, the legislature wants to work through and address reforms in our tax system, we've been talking about reforms for years and years. I've been talking about reforms and leveling the volatility as it relates to this slide. And we didn't get very far because legislature wasn't there, public wasn't there, a lot of stakeholder groups are not there. It's stubborn, it's tough. And so I'm of the mind that we can work through the volatility, and volatility can actually service our needs if we are disciplined. If we try to buy out short-term by making big short-term investments that we can't keep in the long term, and we do so by raising taxes, I think that creates a very challenging competitive frame for this state. And I'm very mindful of our competitive nature vis-a-vis other states. I'm very mindful of the world, again, we invented as it relates to economic growth and output that has been now used against us in terms of other industries, or rather industries that we invented where they've seen strong support in other states that are recruiting those industries and providing incentives. So we have to maintain our competitiveness and our composure as it relates to short-term volatility and not do things that I think have long-term ramifications and profoundly impact the economic conditions of the state and medium and long-term revenue in the state. So no, I'm not supporting the package that was proposed. I made that clear within hours after it was proposed.
Speaking of volatility, it sounds like you don't anticipate, in light of the delayed income tax deadline, any kind of need for short-term cash borrowing, like
No.
revenue anticipation notes or any
No,
kind of?
not even close. We've ample checking account. We have cash balances they can discuss that are among the highest in our state's history. There's a reason Moody's upgraded us a few years ago. We're maintaining our discipline. But even with $42 billion estimated October payments, we think we're in a position, a good position. But my fancy collective team here will walk you through more details on that.
Thanks.
That was a bad word, revenue anticipation note. I don't even want to hear that ever again. That's PTS from a few years ago. I see a few people here.
Hi, Governor. Sophia Bolag from the San Francisco Chronicle. So despite the projected deficit growing, the overall size of the budget you're proposing is actually larger than it was in January. I'm wondering, for people who might be, confused as to why that is, can you explain that and what your thinking is behind, actually kind of growing the budget despite the deficit?
Well, the revenue side of this is what it is. I mean, revenue comes in and revenue goes out. I mean, $2.3 billion. I'll give you an example. We're putting more revenue into reserves. That's an expense. Putting revenues to pay down long-term obligations, PERS and unfunded healthcare liability. That's an expense. We have a constitutional cap under Prop 2, that 10%. There's about $2.3 billion of that also now has to go to infrastructure. That's an expense. So that's how a budget sort of stacks up. It gets a little complicated. I get it. But that's, I think, foundationally, fundamentally, and they could get into more details, why you see something going up and yet you're still experiencing a surplus, or a deficit, that is.
And I wanted to follow up on the earlier question about funding for transit agencies. As you're well aware, a lot of transit agencies are in a really, what they describe as a really dire situation, including a lot of agencies in the Bay Area, like BART, that are saying if they don't get additional help from the state, it could be really catastrophic. And so I'm wondering, are you, even though you're not proposing it today, are you open to adding more money for those agencies? Is that something you're considering?
I'm very concerned about what's going on with BART. I'm very concerned what's going on with a lot of public transit agencies across this state, across our country. Those ridership numbers post-pandemic across the nation are alarming. So we're going to have to do things differently, and we're going to have to address those issues. I know a lot of local agencies are aggressively and appropriately doing just that. We put out a budget last year which provided additional funding. We're just not in a position to solve for their short-term needs at the moment. Now, am I open to your question? I'm open to solving every problem that exists to the extent I can, but you can't do everything. You can't do anything. And so it's about balancing other priorities. And so, of course, we're here to try to find comedy, find help, or provide help where appropriate. But I don't want to overpromise that we're in a position to offset ongoing subsidies to transit agencies all across the state of California within the confines and constructs of our current obligations within the state.
Good morning, Mr. Governor. Thanks for taking the time. Aton Wallace here with Nexstar Media Stations from across the state. Just a clarification question for starters here. I know you mentioned no trigger cuts. To be crystal clear, though, I remember in January that was part of the January proposal. Today you're saying no trigger cuts. Do you mean no trigger cuts at all in this budget, or no new trigger cuts since January?
New trigger cuts. Thank you for the clarification.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank
The second question is something you mentioned earlier, and something I've been speaking with members of your administration about, is that tax deadline extension for millions of Californians due to the storm emergencies. I know you mentioned this today. It does mean a delay in when the state could receive billions of tax dollars in revenue. Realistically, what is the best case scenario you want to see come October on this matter, and what are you most concerned about?
I want all $42 billion and more. I want to be surprised. There was an outstanding question. It was, Adam, was that your question? Do you expect more? I said, I hope so. But, that's the hopeful side of me. Well north of $28.4 billion on the Pitt side and well north of 42 overall. But it's, again, it's what makes this, there's the reason I started this presentation with the word uncertainty. And that's the challenge as it relates to multi-year, the challenge that all of us will face over the next few weeks with the legislative leaders.
Good morning, Governor. Laurel Rosenhall with the LA Times. You mentioned something about an upcoming proposal on permitting reform. I don't think I heard you say the word CEQA. Is that what you're talking about? Are you proposing changes to the Environmental Quality Act?
I said the following. I said, I'm going to leave you wanting. I'm not going to answer any detailed questions. And so I'm going to hold myself to account by fulfilling my commitment to myself of not saying more. Look, we've done 20 CEQA reforms together. So that's self-evident that we've had the capacity to reform in that space. We made some great progress last year on housing in relationship to zoning and land use. We've made great progress in a lot of areas, but we need to scale that progress. And so that's the proposal. We're going to lay it out. You're going to have ample time to take a look at it. It's all being converted into legislative language as we speak. And I am so eager to share it with you. And I think you'll see it much, not just CEQA. Don't get fixated on CEQA. This is a broader strategy across the spectrum that is long overdue, I think, in the state.
And regarding the tax on managed care organizations that you highlighted, if that passes, would those healthcare companies then pass that cost on to their customers? In other words, would this result in higher healthcare costs for Californians?
You'd have to look at what's happened in the past. This is not a new strategy. MCO has been around for years and years. Governor Brown, I think, originally stubbornly negotiating core tenants, a lot of federal funds that are coming, but it's all done in partnership with the institutions. But I'll leave Dr. Galley with a little more familiarity of what the details were in terms of any pass-throughs in the past to answer that question. But we continue to negotiate not only with our stakeholders, but the legislature themselves over the course of the next few months. We'll have better understanding, clarity, exactly where we land in that respect.
And lastly, I wanted to ask about your friend and mentor, Senator Dianne Feinstein.
How did you feel watching her return to work in Washington this week? She's obviously not fully recovered, still experiencing side effects. How did it feel watching her go back into the Capitol?
It was great. I received a text from her chief of staff saying, "Boss is heading to D.C." I was just so happy. That's personal. I'm glad she's recovering. Appears to be recovering. I'm glad she's back. And as an American, as a Democrat, as someone whose father was a judge and understands the consequential nature, not least of which a judge today or yesterday decided there was nothing in 1100 BC that says 19-year-olds can't have a handgun, just overturned that law. I'm being flippant intentionally, how consequential these judicial appointments are. And so I'm glad she's back in that role and we can get these judges out.
Concern about her ability to represent Californians given her frail health?
I look forward to continued recovery, and it was wonderful to see her in Washington, D.C., and I'm glad she's back on the committee.
Hey, Governor. Jeremy White with Politico. Your proposal looks to a yet-to-be-passed climate bond to offset some of those climate spending reductions. You've also talked about a behavioral health bond. Are you hoping the legislature is going to pass 2 different bonds in the next year or so?
I am indeed. But not the legislature. The people of the state support those efforts. But we've eager partners with the legislature. And if you need proof points, you may recall the press conference we had in L.A. with the pro tem herself and other legislative leaders as it relates to the importance and the imperative of helping our veterans and importance and imperative of addressing the needs for more units, clinically supported campuses, and individual home settings for people with severe behavioral health issues and the spectrum. And obviously, you are aware of the efforts by members of the legislature currently as it relates to climate bills. So we are in working partnership with those key leaders.
Given that the last major bond measure on the ballot to fund educational facilities did not pass muster with voters, is it realistic to expect them to pass not 1 but 2 different bonds, especially when they're hearing about economic downtimes?
Yeah, I mean, that's to be determined. I think the issue of behavioral health is an issue that strikes home universally. There's not a human being in here that hasn't been touched directly or indirectly. I think that extends to 40 million Californians. I see this as one of the most consequential and important issues of our time. It manifests not just as it relates to what's happening on the streets and sidewalks and our quality of life, but impacts, in some ways, more horrifically, people in silence that are suffering alone, that are isolated and disconnected more than ever, suicide rates and the like. So I think it will be overwhelmingly supportive. And what more evidence do we need on climate? What more evidence do we need on climate than what we've had to experience with this weather whiplash in the state of California? From 3 years, the driest of dries, to a 3-week period of the wettest of wets, back to back. I mean, it's just extraordinary. You don't have to believe in science. You've got to believe your own lived experience. And I think that's shared as well overwhelmingly by 40 million Californians, people that may not believe in climate change, but believe in lifestyle, believe in place, believe that the world that they've grown up in is radically changing and altering. Communities that have been wiped off the map as a consequence of these extremes. So I feel very confident in both those efforts.
Hi, Governor. Camille Von Cannell from Politico. I wanted to know a little bit more about the climate bond, specifically what guided your decisions to punt some of these programs that were in the budget previously, like the Salton Sea restoration, dam safety, sustainable groundwater management, to a hypothetical climate bond, and do you have a number in mind?
Well, we're working with the legislature on that, so I don't want to determine where we'll land. It's in partnership with. So we have a lot of members, a lot of points of view. I see Wade Crowfoot right here, and he has a strong point of view on what should be included, what should not be. So that's part of the give and take. Look, $48 billion, this is just, there's no jurisdiction that we know of, subnational, that's ever invested the kind of investment we're making in climate. And we think we have more work to do. And that's pretty humbling and sober to express, not least of which in our world-leading, not just nation-leading efforts to transition by 2035 our vehicle fleets. It was great to see. I just saw Rhode Island join. Everybody's joining. It's amazing now how quickly this transition is taking shape. We just got the clean truck waiver from the Biden administration. We need to prepare for that. We have a lot of work to do in terms of grid, in terms of vehicle to grid, in terms of reimagining mobility in relationship to the grid. That goes to the issue of transportation funding. All these things are connected, and looking at vehicles very differently and looking at fleets very differently because of this transition, software, not just hardware. I mean, this is really exciting. This is about radically transitioning our economy and dominating in the next big global industry. So I see this bond as economically catalytic, and obviously has profound environmental benefits in terms of health, costs, which goes to the issues of Medi-Cal and Medicaid, goes to the issues related across the spectrum of budgetary support. So it's a very exciting time, and I'm excited to present with legislative leaders this opportunity to the voters in near term.
Hi, Governor. Laura Cordy with Politico here. I know you've been paying close attention to the fentanyl crisis. You have money in the budget this year for preventative measures like Narcan and fentanyl test strips. I wanted to know if you could share your thoughts on whether increased criminal penalties should be part of our playbook for combating fentanyl.
I know there's discussions in the legislature. I'll leave it at that. There's discussions that are now taking shape in my office to further that conversation. I'm very mindful of the conflicting points of view on this subject. And so all I'll offer at this moment is willingness to engage as we are with legislative leaders in that space. Here's our proposal. We're not waiting around for anyone else's proposal. We've done as much or more than any other state in the nation. This naloxone distribution project is truly nation-leading. Led to 130,000 reversions, overdoses. The work we're doing on the border, we didn't wait for we didn't wait for the legislature. We didn't react. We were proactive. I kept them down the day I got in my office as it relates to our drug interdiction strategies. We've changed our drug interdiction strategies that primarily were stacked heroin, methamphetamine to fentanyl. We continue to do more. Broadly, $1 billion has been invested in opioid offsets in terms of substance abuse disorder. So across the spectrum, but I am aware of some legislative proposals in that space. And as I say, we're engaging with legislative leaders.
And then kind of a tangential follow-up here. Title 42 was lifted this week. I understand you were on a call with other governors and the Secretary of Homeland Security. Could you speak about any details about what went on in that call and how the lifting of Title 42 is going to affect California and California cities?
Well, thank you for the question. As you can see, I anticipated it. We have 9 shelters, 3 full-service shelters. And this is important, a little bit of background, because people may not be familiar with this. In 2019, I worked with Pro Tem Atkins, and she led an effort to get $25 million from her colleagues to support our first migrant facility in San Diego, primarily in partnership with Jewish Family Services and Catholic Charities. It has now since grown to 9 robust shelters in 3 counties, not just San Diego, but Imperial and Riverside. We have these respite shelters that have been providing for years now, despite what has been said on networks like Fox News, testing, vaccinations, and other supports for migrants that have come in. It's a remarkable program. Office of Emergency Service, Department of Public Health, a lot of nonprofits and local partners that have been supporting those efforts. They're very costly. Let me be specific, 419 point something million last year, 420 million. The challenge for us is to maintain, this goes directly to your question of what we talked about with the White House. The challenge for us is to maintain that level of commitment, $1.2 billion, I'll give you the specifics here, to support those efforts over the last few years. 370,000 people have been supported. So our capacity to continue to do that has been tempered by the budgetary constraints. And this, by the way, is not news. I talked all about this in January. So this has been out there. And we've been working with our partners throughout the state. So we are currently operating in this environment on the left through the end of the fiscal year. As of this morning, I get daily updates in the space. I've been at the border, as you know, on many, many occasions. We'll be back shortly. And visiting these shelters. Our capacity last night was ample in the 3 counties, different capacity depending on the county. But we're working with the NGOs on this funding strategy that will shift from, you see, Department of Public Health to social services and transition, which will be led now by the NGOs, where we'll still prioritize the most vulnerable. We won't be providing the comprehensive services that, frankly, and this is not an indictment, we've said this publicly on multiple occasions, and the Biden administration agrees, should be supported by the federal government. But because of the incapacity for Congress to do their job and support or at least engage the president on comprehensive immigration reform, a proposal he put out day one, because of a broken immigration system and the absolute unwillingness to address that, we don't have the resources. And so we are trying to be creative. And that was the spirit of the meeting, to your question yesterday with governors. We need more support. Locals need more support. The constraints the Biden administration are under are real. And we recognize that. And I wish folks like Kevin McCarthy would focus more on comprehensive immigration reform to actually solve the problem than demagogue the problem and play games with proposals that cut border patrol, cut police funding in relationship to the debt ceiling debate, and then separate that to add back, I guess, from his cuts funding yesterday on a border bill that's purely performative in order to assert that at least he's trying to do something, when in fact he's done nothing fundamentally to address this issue since he's been Speaker and, frankly, since he's been in Congress. So forgive me for being so damn pointed, but we're as dumb as we want to be as a nation on this. And it's not just Title 42 is a public health issue. I mean, the public health order is over. I love the Republicans saying we shouldn't have had the public health order. Well, then how can you justify 42? But it's the immigration system that's broken, and it needs to be reformed. This is not just what's happening at the border is a manifestation of our failure to fundamentally address the need for comprehensive reform. And the great irony of that shouldn't be lost on any Californian. It was Ronald Reagan that last sought some common sense in this place in 1986. I wish Mr. McCarthy and his colleagues would look him up.
Hi, Governor. Wes Van Tyscher from Politico here. You talked about some of the big changes that will be needed for California to meet its energy goals. Another idea that's out there is this proposal to expand energy sharing in the West through a regional transmission organization at CalISO. Are you supportive of the current legislative proposal to do that, or other things that could be done administratively along those lines?
I'm smiling because deeply familiar with the history of this as a lieutenant governor, watching Governor Brown's efforts in this space, deeply familiar because of my time with ISO and conversations and with legislative leaders in this space, and I'll leave it at that. We're engaged in those conversations.
Similarly, there's a proposal for a central procurement mechanism that would be at Department of Water Resources. I think offshore wind developers, some others are looking for some more certainty in that the market will be there for these new resources coming online. Do you support that proposal?
Well, we've been pushing in that direction. We laid that out in a report that we publicized last year. I, in fact, will be coming out with an update on that energy transition report preview in the next few weeks, unless Anthony says it's the next few months, but very shortly. And we'll have more to say on that topic. But as you know, we feel very strongly. And that was one of the real lessons learned after the PG&E bankruptcy coming out of that, is how to address the centralization of some of that procurement. All of this in relationship to some of the permitting reforms that will also be advancing. So I appreciate very much, more than you know, both questions, and assure you we'll have a lot more to say on both topics very shortly.
Good morning, Governor. Blake Jones with Politico. I wanted to ask you about your proposal to mandate dyslexia screenings in K-2. It had been 4 years. You hadn't come out in support of mandating screenings. The California Teachers Association in the legislature has been, opposing this kind of mandate pretty strongly. And I'm wondering, was CTA opposition a big factor in you waiting, these 4 years, or what was the change?
Yeah, no, that and I can assure you that would be the laziest of laziest punditry, and I'm not suggesting that's your assessment. I am, as you know, not interested in this subject. I'm deeply engaged in it. Consequence of no speech, no notes, because of my own struggles in this space. What I didn't want to do is rush to do something without being prepared to do it right. And what I've found, and we have our own lived experience with this, is often people are screened in a way where they're unnecessarily identified and stigmatized to the extent we still have work to do around the stigmatization of dyslexia for the wrong reasons. Often they're English as second language learners. Often because of lack of cultural competency in this space, a capacity to address the nuances and complexities as it relates to one's lived experience, race, ethnicity, and the like. We weren't, from my humble perspective, prepared to do that. That's why, working with the legislature, we invested tens of millions of dollars in partnership with our own UC, UCSF, to create a nation-leading screening module. And that is almost ready. And that's why we, I believe, are ready and engaged. Senator Portantino has been fantastic in this space, stubborn, and I'm proud of his stubbornness. And his willingness to engage us on his bill allows us to land on an agreement, and we are now moving forward. So that's the contours of that history. I'm really excited about what California will be exporting to other states. It's not just about being one of other states. It's about being best of state in terms of the work we're doing.
Yeah, if legislation stalls on this subject, would that be something that would bring you down to the Capitol, that you'd come push the caucus?
I'm not
on?
worried about it stalling. We're going to get this done. I'm not worried about it. And I'm down at the Capitol every day. I don't know what you guys... Like there's a romantic version of that I think we're all fixated to. Yeah.
Governor, hi. Samantha Young with KFF Health News. You spoke about how hospitals are hurting. I'm wondering if you're worried about more hospitals closing, and wondering if your budget ask for the MCO tax, is that going to be enough to help these hospitals, or should more be done, like giving them the $1.5 billion that they're asking for?
Well, I think we did better than that. $11.1 billion as it relates to reimbursement rates, getting up to what, 87.5 on average of Medicare. That's going to have a bigger impact ongoing than one-off supports. $150 million revolving loan funds, no interest associated with that. Good short-term support. Legislatively adopted on my desk, creating that new fund, all pursuant to the MCO tax. So, no, I think not only are we mindful of this issue, not only mindful, but you're seeing in other states just calamitous impact, particularly the states that didn't even expand their Medicaid system. I mean, it's just remarkable, and how their rural hospitals are collapsing. But we're mindful that there are many hospitals that are struggling, and we have a short-term solution, and we think with the reimbursement and some other strategies, which we'll also be illuminating, we will be doing a lot more than just a short-term fix.
Thank you. I had a follow-up to some of the fentanyl questions that have already been asked. The state, in the budget, you mentioned the new money that's been put forth, things that you're doing at the border. I'm wondering, is this enough to turn the tide for the increasing deaths that we are still seeing from all the overdoses?
Well, no, this is... for a year, this consumes me, as it should. As a parent, it scares the hell out of me. As a governor, I see it. I recognize the nature of what's occurred on the streets. I remember Dr. Galley and I, we put out a plan a couple years ago on this. Didn't get a lot of attention. People weren't as focused on it. We're now updating that with Trank, xylazine or whatever but with the vernacular on the streets, Trank, which is this veterinarian drug, which is even more insidious as it relates to the impact it has on one's flesh. I was down with my entire team down in the Tenderloin, but it could have been anywhere in California, anywhere USA. Walking the streets, seen this firsthand, and the devastation, the human toll, the suffering. And that's why we initiated our efforts with the Guard and the DA's office and SFPD and the DOJ and others. So from an enforcement perspective, from a perspective of short-term overdose prevention and the work we're doing on test strips and encampments and overdose medication for the schools, across the spectrum, we are mindful education that is done in this space, the PSAs we're doing. But the human impacts of this are just devastating. And for the grace of God, go any of us have a loved one that just, unknowingly falls prey to this. So the answer to your question is, humbly, no, I submit we have a lot more work to do. And that's why I stepped up in May with an additional $172 million above the January budget, which itself was a significant increase over the prior year. And certainly look forward to working with the legislature if they find need to do even more. But there are throughputs in terms of these proposals as well. It's not just about throwing a bigger numeric. It's about actually making sure that we're driving successful initiatives and we're accountable to delivering on it.
Thank you.
Hi, Governor. Rachel Booth from Politico. I'm told I'm the last question.
Only 30 of you. Why not more?
And we're hiring.
We're hiring. You are hiring.
I wanted to follow up on some of this question about hospital funding. The California Hospital Association has been really out front that they need $1.5 billion to keep hospitals afloat. They say 1 in 5 is about to close, half of them are operating in the red. Do you believe them? And then why not include that money the way they're asking?
Well, I think you understand the why, and I think I framed the why in the third, fourth, fifth slides. Can't do everything, but can do something, and we are doing something, and they know that, and I appreciate their support, helping us with the legislature to get that bill on my desk, and I look forward to discussing more this issue when I have the opportunity to sit down and sign that bill. As it relates to the MCO tax discussions, we've had advanced conversations with them on the $19.4 billion, and we continue to have the conversations on the details related to $11.1 billion in out years that will have a direct, not indirect impact in terms of some of their issues. I'm very sensitive to the challenges they face, absolutely, and I can assure you we are in active, not listening, active engagement, two-way conversations in this topic, and will continue to. And I'm mindful that none of us believe we're out of the woods, and this is a national problem, not just a California problem, but I'm proud that in California we at least are taking some short-term efforts and did early action to not just assert that, to prove that.
And lastly, just on MHSA reform, I've heard some concerns that, using it for housing, bringing in people who are getting treatment for substance abuse only is maybe asking the fund to do too much. I see that you're already taking $500 million from MHSI to use on housing. Is that premature while these discussions are still ongoing?
If you don't have stability in housing, living out in the elements, I joke all the time. I joke with all of you, during the Trump years, I had to self-medicate every night with a glass of wine watching Trump press conferences. Imagine living out in the elements in an encampment for 2-3 years. For the grace of God, go any of us. You got to find stability. Housing is foundational. If you can ever solve these problems, if you don't have that fundamental linkage, look what's happening on the streets. Look at the crisis. With all due respect, I have zero interest in the status quo ante as it relates to the Mental Health Services Act. By the way, nor does its author, Darrell Steinberg. The world that existed 20 years ago doesn't exist today. And so the whole point of CalAIM and our reforms around Medi-Cal is that fundamental recognition and addressing these issues in a way we've never addressed them in the past. We've siloed them. Here's a remarkable opportunity. Yeah, that's uncomfortable. Change has its enemies, and we are promoting change. We are not interested in failing more efficiently any longer. We want to accelerate progress. We know now what works. And here's a fund that was well-meaning and established for a world that no longer exists, and we have the opportunity to take a third of those dollars and to really target the most chronic, most vulnerable, and produce real results that I think will produce progress and ultimately promote some well-being with the public that, frankly, is ticked off and doesn't feel like we get it or are getting things done. And I think the public deserves this. I think the people suffering deserve this. And if you hear stubbornness, it's because I am going to push back against those that are arguing for the status quo. And with that, with a smile on his face, I thank you all very, very much. And hopefully you have no questions for Joe and the team, but if you do, they're coming on up. We appreciate you guys. Thank you, guys.
All right. I'd first like to thank the governor for once again providing a very thorough, detailed explanation of the May revision. I'm going to keep my comments brief. I think he did a great job of covering where we are in the May revision, and given his overview, it should be obvious that our structure in really protecting the progress, holding the line where we were at the governor's budget means there are not a lot of new commitments, proposals in the May revision. Start briefly by following up on a couple of the questions that were asked. The first one, I believe, was the 6 months of transitional CalAIM funding for rent maintained in the budget. The simple answer to that is yes. And I think related to that, overall, the approach in this budget, again, was kind of to hold the line at the governor's budget. There were not a lot of new reductions in the budget, and there were very few, if any, reductions that would actually have an impact on any of the programs, services beyond the level that they were at the governor's budget. There was a question on whether or not we were at risk of having to turn to external borrowing anytime soon. As of the last April SEO cash report, the state still has cash cushions of just over $109 billion. We don't foresee having to turn to external borrowing anywhere in the near term. Question on changes to the trigger. The governor was correct, and as he stated in his overview, we did not add any items to the trigger. However, there were two small items that were pulled out of the trigger that he referenced in his proposal. $30 million for women in construction. That amount is over 2 years. There's $15 million in the budget year, $15 million in budget year +1, and then $49.8 million for the public health workforce. So those two items were pulled out of the trigger and restored. The funding for them was restored in the May revision. Lastly, there was a question on the increased MCO tax proposal, whether or not that's going to result in pass-throughs. And the short answer on that is that the plans are reimbursed for every dollar on Medi-Cal lives. They're reimbursed $1, and so the plan to increase the MCO tax focuses on the medical lives, and which will significantly limit the impacts of any potential pass-throughs. With that, I'd just like to quickly reinforce a couple of things that points the governor made regarding the overall structure approach of the budget. Number one, as it pertains to the $42 billion being pushed to October due to the IRS delay in the tax filing, extending the tax filing to October, that really not only creates a heightened level of uncertainty in our forecast, but it really impacted our forecast at the May revision because we didn't have the normal actual tax collection data that we typically have in April, which is a big input in our revenue forecast for the May revision. So not having that really creates this heightened level of uncertainty, and to the governor's point, really was a big factor in our approach to really holding the line here, not taking too drastic of action in either direction, and having the opportunity in October, once the October receipts come in, to reassess at that time and react appropriately as we're building the governor's budget for 2024. Would also note just overall in terms of revenue, I know there were questions related to this. The governor went over it a couple in his presentation and answering the questions, but in terms of the huge surpluses that we saw the last couple of years and how we got to where we are now, the governor referenced the total amounts. Percentage-wise, our general fund revenue from our largest three sources, the personal income tax, corporation tax, and sales tax, grew by just about 30% in 2020-21 and 19% in 2021-22. These were unprecedented growth levels in percentage terms, as was the governor went over in the actual dollar amounts. But then what we're seeing now in terms of the softening in our revenues, in the current year, we're seeing a reduction of 8.1%, and in the budget year, we're forecasting a reduction of 2.2%. So what we saw during these huge surpluses, growth in revenues of just under 50%, and then as we're experiencing this decline in revenues, it's just about 10%. So we're still, in terms of overall revenues, much higher than we were prior to seeing those spikes in the last couple of years. And the last thing I would just note is in the overall structure, as we are solving this additional budget problem of $9.3 billion, now total budget problem of $31.5 billion. We're solving an additional budget problem at the May revision, largely with added solutions that, again, hold the line at the governor's budget. No significant cuts or reduction that are going to impact programs or services. And in taking this approach, in waiting till October, we felt like it was prudent to ensure that we did not utilize the rainy day fund at this time, holding on to the level of reserves, the $37.2 billion total reserves that we have at the May revision is important, given the fact that there's so much uncertainty. We're going to assess things in October, and we felt like in order to continue to protect the program services progress that we made to this point, that we need to keep that, what is essentially the biggest tool in our toolbox, available to be able to mitigate any future problems we may face as we're building the budget next fall. Lastly, before I turn to questions, just would like to thank the governor, but and also thank the agency secretaries who are here, their staffs, their departments. Building this budget is really a team effort throughout the entire governor's administration. Also want to thank the governor's office, their staff, and then lastly, want to thank, of course, the Department of Finance, our executive team, our program budget managers who are here today, all of the staff at the Department of Finance who work tirelessly throughout the year to ensure that California has a budget every year, and have worked tirelessly these last couple of months. We'll continue to work tirelessly going forward as we finalize the budget with the legislature. Lastly, also, in thanking the staff, want to give a special acknowledgement to Chief Deputy Director for Budgets, Erica Lee, who not only worked along with our team in getting to this place, but really was a big part of today and getting us ready to give this presentation today. So thank you, Erica, the rest of the team, the rest of the administration. With that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, thanks for doing this. Nicole Nixon with Cap Radio. I want to follow up on what you mentioned at the end about reassessing in October after the delayed tax deadline. What are the options for the state if those revenues are still below forecast in October? Is that when you would consider dipping into the rainy day fund, or just new discussions at that point with lawmakers?
There would be new discussions first within the administration as we build the governor's budget, always having discussions with the legislature. But at that point, we really would have to assess the overall situation as we're in the fall. But we would obviously have the reserves available, and that's part of the reason for holding on to them. So they would be available at that point if the situation does not improve. And so it definitely would be part of the conversation.
Then question about the MCO tax. In January, the January budget, the revenue estimation for that was about $6.5 billion. In this budget, it's jumped to over $19 billion. So I'm curious about the accounting for that big jump.
So there's going to be a proposal that is that will be released through trail bill language in the coming days, and that will kind of outline the new overall structure of the tax. And so essentially the structure of the tax is changing in a way that is going to increase, and I think as I noted, focus on increasing on the Medi-Cal live side, which will end up increasing the total revenue that will be received from the tax.
Thanks.
Hey, Camille Von Cannell from Politico. There's been a focus on the additional flood project money, and I know $125 million of that comes from drought contingency. I was wondering where the rest of that additional money for floods is coming from in the proposal.
Yeah, so obviously we're facing a not insignificant budget problem at this time, but we're also, as this administration, the legislature, has continued to do, ensuring that we are addressing the most pressing needs that we are currently facing. And so it's true that $125 million was in the governor's budget as a drought contingency. We have now moved that as a flood contingency, and given that we know that there are significant risks that present themselves in the near term due to the huge snowpacks that we have now, and once they start melting, that we wanted to ensure that we were providing resources to be prepared for that and to help continue to mitigate flood risks going forward. So this is a current priority that's urgent, that we knew we had to address in the budget, and so we didn't necessarily move funding from somewhere else for this, but we found ways to make it fit in the overall structure.
This is Adam Beam from the Associated Press. Are there deficits projected in the out years, and if so, can you tell me what they are?
There are deficits projected in the out years. as there were in the governor's budget. Give me 1 second. There will be operational structural deficits in 26-27 of just under 14 billion, and 25-26 just under 10 billion. In the next year, budget year plus one, 24-25 of just under 5 billion. There will also be some structural imbalances in the SFEU that grow in the out years. But I just want to say that this, the structural imbalances and the SFEU balances in the out years, the governor mentioned this, are not unprecedented, and particularly in bad budget times, and obviously facing a $31.5 billion shortfall could be considered not the best budget fiscal situation. And so this is something that the state has dealt with in the past. When we've dealt with budget shortfalls, we've projected out-year deficits. We've also had structural deficits in the budget year during good times. I think the governor mentioned 2014, 15, 16, and 18 all had structural deficits in the budget year. In 18, it was about $5 billion. And so these are not unprecedented, particularly when we're facing budget shortfalls. It's something that we are really aware of. It's a reason why we structured the budget the way that we did, that we held on to the reserves, and that we know that the governor outlined there are risks going forward, and we have to stay vigilant and ensure that as we strive to continue to protect the commitments that we made to this point, we're able to adjust going forward to ensure that we continue to enact balanced budgets.
Hi, Joe. My name is Angela Hart. Nice to meet you. I'm with KFF Health News. Not sure if my question is best for you or Secretary Galley, but I have a two-part for you. On the MCO proposal, I'll await the TBL that's coming, but in terms of the general idea, it's a little confusing because the proposal talks about different types of care, like primary care, for example. So it's the idea to raise the reimbursements through Medi-Cal based on the different types of payers and providers, like primary care, for example, or like, doctors and hospitals and insurers? Or is the idea to raise the PMPM that is attached to each person? That's the first part. And then it's a little complicated. So my second part has to do with the comparison between MCO and the HQAF. Sounds like MCO, there's some ability to, some discretion over how that money gets spent and distributed. Is that true also for HQAF, or is that more strict in terms of how that money goes out? I can repeat anything if it's confusing.
Thank you for the question. I'm lucky enough to have Dr. Galley still here, and I will defer to him on those answers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for the question, Angela. A couple things first. In terms of the MCO structure this time around versus in prior years, a few are really important things, and even compared to governor's budget. So the 19+ billion that's being referenced, really in January budget, it was really a 3-year MCO proposal, 24, 25, 26, at about $6+ billion. That's roughly 2 point something each of the 3 years. In this proposal, the department went back working with CMS, looking at the potential for the opportunity, and clearly there was more space to be able to work with our sort of local health plan partners and our federal partners to bring into the state significantly more funds. So instead of roughly $2 billion a year, you're looking at a full year between $5 and $6 billion per year. So when you look at 3 years plus 3 quarters in 2023, because the hope is we work with the legislature and all of our partners to submit this in the month of June, allowing us to go retroactive to April, so 3 quarters or 9 more months of potential revenue for California, bringing that total between 19 and $20 billion. So that's the difference between January budget proposal and what we have today. The second piece is that the focus on a significant portion of those funds, unlike in prior years, is really to strengthen, as the governor said, our commitment to the safety net programs, and the chief among those, which is our Medi-Cal program. And when you're talking about specific rates, we are committed in 2024 looking to raise 3 specific rates: primary care, maternal care, and non-specialty behavioral health care through our managed care plans, and to get to 87.5% of Medicare rates. That is the first goal. We then will engage a number of partners, the legislature, on looking at additional investments in 25 and beyond to support other sorts of payments to providers, broad set of providers, and we're in conversations and really looking forward to those conversations in order to additionally strengthen the Medi-Cal program moving forward. So different from the hospital QAF that you mentioned, Angela, that has its statutory requirements on how that money is both raised and used. The MCO revenue has less rules around that, and so gives us an opportunity as a state in many ways to not just advance the benefits that we've been talking about over the last few years through CalAIM, Health for All, expansions that I think we're all really proud of seeing here, but now strengthening other parts of that system through these additional funds that will be spent over a number of years to hopefully create not just a stronger, but a more stable Medi-Cal system moving forward.
Thank you. Just really quickly to make sure I understand. So it sounds like with MCO, there's kind of a 2-part. The first would look to raise the Medi-Cal rate, and that money would follow that person, that per member per month. That rate would follow that person when they go into those types of care. And then the second part of it, there's additional pot of money that there's negotiations around how that would be spent. Is that correct?
I would say the first set of commitments around increasing our rates and investment are in primary care, maternal care, and non-specialty behavioral health care. There are so many other elements where providers are doing important work, hospitals, clinics, primary care providers, other physician and non-physician practices committed to serving the Medicaid population, where we have opportunities to really, through our sense of what is the most impactful and what is the most highly leverageable, opportunities to make additional investments. But we're starting with 3 very key areas that California has been committed to. You hear the governor talk about, let's not just provide sick care, let's not just depend on emergency rooms, but let's go upstream, avoiding those. So you see these 3 areas as the initial areas of investment, and then we will enter into conversations about what are our next steps. And I know there's a lot of eagerness around this. We're eager as well. We believe in making these investments and sustaining them because we all depend on a really strong healthcare delivery system. I'll just add one last thing. In prior MCO conversations, the funds were not as directly linked to health and the healthcare delivery system. So a number of partners who over the years have had questions about both the revenue generation and the revenue spend here, I think are aligned around supporting this system, making California's bedrock of healthcare stronger as a result, and we're looking forward to that opportunity.
Hi, Laura Mahoney with Bloomberg. There were a few tax proposals in the January budget. I just want to confirm that they're still in there and whether they've changed at all. The film and TV tax credit extension and making that refundable. The proposal related to the trust proposal, and the new employment credit flexibility on where the the geographic areas are that the people get the credit from?
Yes.
Are those all the same?
They're
And there's-
all still in the budget. We're having discussions with the legislature, so the legislature has definitely been chiming in and has inserted their input. But yes, those are all still part of the governor's proposals.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, this was a question for Dr. Galley from Laurel Rosenhall at the LA Times.
I inadvertently stole Joe's phone as well. Sorry, Joe.
Thank you so much. Just to get back to the MCO tax for a minute, I know that California has had that in the past, but given how complicated the healthcare marketplace is and how complicated pass-throughs and taxes are, is there just a simple answer to the question of whether an increase in the managed care organization tax would result in them passing it on to consumers and therefore higher health care costs for Californians? I mean, is there a simple yes, no?
So the best way to answer that is we have worked hard with our plan partners in both the commitment and investing a significant share of these dollars in the healthcare delivery system, which they support. They believe is not just the right thing to do, but the strategic thing to do. And in structuring the tax, that the impact on plans has been thoughtfully proposed, minimized, so that exactly to the point that if there is any pass-through whatsoever, that it is minimal, literally cents on a premium per month. And so it's been a lot of hard work to make sure that that's minimized as we move forward with this proposal.
And how is it that there could be an increased tax on a service that so many people pay for and that it doesn't result in a larger tax to the customers?
Because of the structure of the tax, as Joe was alluding to, a significant portion of the tax is on the Medicaid side of our commitments and those Medicaid plans, which as part of the structure of the tax is shouldered by the state and not by individual consumers. And so the much lower impact on what we talk about, the commercial side of the business, is why that is the case.
Last question. It looks like the new positions at the California Energy Commission for the oil penalty oversight stuff is being paid for with an increase to some sort of electricity bills. Can you kind of explain how that works?
Yeah, the Energy Commission is primarily supported by the Energy Resources Program account. And in addition to the proposal for the additional positions at the commission, there's also a May revised proposal to raise the statutory cap on the IRPA surcharge, tie it to a CPI, and make some other changes. So there is a proposal to increase the revenue in IRPA to continue to support CEC.
And is that something that ratepayers are paying on their utility bills every month?
I believe it is, but part of this proposal will also be to extend the surcharge to behind the meter ratepayers as well. So again, to try to spread out some of the costs.
But like effectively here, Californians could be paying a little bit more on their energy bills every month in order to fund these positions at the CEC?
So there is a proposal for the positions at the CEC. There's also, the CEC is generally supported by the IRPA account. There have been some structural issues with the account for a few years now. This is not the first time a proposal like this has been put forward, so it's not necessary that this is put forward because of this new responsibility. This has been an ongoing issue.
Okay, well, it looks like from the description that this increase would raise about $6 million more per year, and $5.9 million is proposed for 14 new positions for this petroleum oversight division or whatever it's called. So it sort of looks like a one-to-one kind of thing. But you're saying they're not. It's not a one-to-one thing.
I'm saying that this is the IRPA account has had some structural issues for a number of years now. We've put forward proposals to increase the revenue in the past years. This is not the first time. And so we're, again, recognizing that there have been increased costs at the CEC, and the IRPA has not met those costs in the past, and the need to address the structural issue has been ongoing and will be ongoing outside of this proposal. And so that is an issue, a separate issue. This does create pressure, but that is, it's not a new issue that we've presented proposals to increase revenue into IRPA.
Okay, thanks.
And with that, I think it concludes our question and answers.
Thank you.